So yesterday I spoke about the talks between Russia and the United States that took place in Saudi Arabia. Since those talks, Russia launched 167 drones and 2 ballistic missiles at Ukraine. Ukrainian air defenses shot down 106 of them. And this is because the talks with the United States aren't actually about Ukraine for Russia, and Russia is not showing any real willingness to negotiate an end to its war in Ukraine in good faith. Intelligence reports confirm that Putin's ambitions remain as expansive as ever. He still wants full control of Ukraine and believes he can outlast both Ukraine and the West on the battlefield. He isn't making any meaningful concessions in these discussions, and that is because he is just buying time. This isn't about peace. This is about Russia using negotiations as a stalling tactic, a chance to regroup and reinforce while watching as aid to Ukraine gets paused for said negotiations. So his strategy appears to be playing along just enough to see what he can get, to test how much the US and its allies are willing to compromise. Russia isn't withdrawing troops, they aren't stopping missile and drone attacks, and they aren't scaling back their objectives because they are still, as of last night and the rhetoric that came out of last night, want to dismantle Ukraine as a sovereign nation. And once again, I want to highlight that Ukraine was not invited to these discussions, and neither were our European allies. So the optics are pretty clear here. Russia wants to negotiate on its own terms without the interference of those most affected by the war. Excluding Ukraine from talks about its own future is a glaring red flag, one that raises concerns about the real objectives behind these discussions. Putin continues to claim that Ukraine isn't a legitimate state, that its government is invalid, and that Zelensky has no right to negotiate, which is why they didn't want Ukraine at the negotiating table with the US. And the US granted Russia this concession and validated their sentiment by negotiating around Ukraine with Ukraine's primary enemy. This is all part of a calculated Putin strategy. If Russia doesn't recognize Ukraine's sovereignty, it doesn't have to respect any agreements Ukraine makes. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is making territorial demands but offering nothing in return. There is no negotiations here, only ultimatums. Russia's statements were vague. Their commitments were non-existent. The Russian Foreign Ministry talked about economic cooperation, nuclear responsibility, and rebuilding diplomatic ties, but when the conversation turned to Ukraine, we heard nothing meaningful. Russia used the Saudi talks to frame itself as an equal partner to the United States as a global power, emphasizing US-Russia relations rather than the war itself. Lavrov and other Russian officials painted the meeting as constructive, claiming progress was made and that both sides were committed to dialogue. Putin then said diplomatic relations between the US and Russia have been restored. This was a calculated move as well, because the thing is, restoring diplomatic relations did nothing for the US, Europe, or Ukraine. That concession granted by the US to the Kremlin was 100% beneficial for the Kremlin because now they can say, see, we haven't stopped this war, we're still killing Ukrainians, but the US has restored relations and wants to be friendly. They clearly are accepting or are even supportive of what we are doing to Ukraine. That is how the Russian people will interpret this because that is how the Kremlin will paint it to them. This was further hammered home when Trump, who was commenting on Ukraine, complaining about not being invited to the meeting, said, quote, "Today I heard, oh, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal," end quote. For the record, Ukraine did not start this war, period. And these comments triggered rare moments of unity in Ukraine, where even Zelensky's political rivals stood by him, rejecting Trump's claims as both false and damaging. So Russia's game has been clear to me all along, and it should be becoming clear to the lay people across the world as of now. This is not about ending the war for Russia. It's about using these talks to stall and pressure the United States into making economic concessions. That's all Russia wants because they know internally the war is going to continue and they know removing sanctions is so much easier than reimposing them. And so if they can get the Trump administration to remove sanctions, that's a win for them because their war will continue. And how do I know this? Well, rather than discussing anything dealing with the war, Russian officials pushed proposals for business cooperation, investment opportunities, and economic partnerships. This is a deliberate move playing on Donald Trump's business mind, but the deals solely benefit Moscow and offer really nothing in return, not for Ukraine and not for the United States. If the United States accepts these economic overtures without pushing for real concessions on Ukraine, it's basically giving away all its leverage. And all of this is happening while Ukraine continues to physically fight for its survival. President Zelensky has shown a willingness to compromise in a meaningful manner, to engage in real negotiations. He's even expressed an openness to direct talks with Putin, which is something the Russians have outrightly dismissed. Ukraine has worked to build an international coalition for peace, hosted summits, engaged with world leaders, and offered diplomatic solutions, none of which Russia has reciprocated with. But the Kremlin isn't interested in diplomacy, it's interested in domination, and it seems like the US is playing right into his hands. So Russia is not looking for peace, it's looking for an opportunity to buy time, to weaken Western support, and position itself as an unavoidable global power that is equal to the United States because they are having bilateral discussions with the US over third-party countries. This war is not even remotely close to over, and it's no closer than it was 48 hours ago, because Russia is not backing down. In fact, they probably now see this policy path from the United States as new leverage for getting what they want out of Ukraine.